And then the next glyph might be, this is the date on which he acceded to the throne.
The dates fit her theory perfectly. The time from the birth of one king to the accession of the next was never more than 60 years, a reasonable human lifetime.
Her hypothesis then was that each one of these series were the life story of a particular ruler. It was a dynasty she was dealing with. It was history for the first time.
Suddenly, Proskouriakov's brilliant insight transformed the images on the stele. The alcoves were thrones. The figures were not gods and priests, as Thompson believed, but kings and queens. This was a family history. Ruler 1 ascends the throne in 603. 5 years later, he is a warrior with prisoners at his feet. 15 years later, Ruler 2 takes the throne. He is 12 years old. His mother stands beside him. At age 26, he is dressed for battle. 10 years later, he is still a warrior, but considerably heavier. He reigns for 47 years. Proskouriakov's story followed the reigns of 7 kings.
She laid it out, all the dates with all the sequences for each series, and I looked at it, my knees went weak. I said, Tanya, you've done it. It's the most important discovery of all time.
She presented the paper to Eric Thompson, and Eric Thompson said, oh, Tanya, you know that can't possibly be true. There is no history in the inscriptions. And she said that the next morning, she came back to work to be greeted by Eric Thompson, who said, you're absolutely right.
Which is amazing for somebody like that who'd been a lifelong opponent of the idea that this was history. And that was it. That just changed everything. We now know that we were dealing with history on these monuments.
The next advance in breaking the code came in May of 1945, when the Russian army marched into Berlin. In the ranks was a young officer named Yuri Valentinovich Konorisov.
He told me once that in the ruins of the National Library, he found a book lying there that had survived the fires and all the rest of it, that he picked up, which was a very good black and white reproduction of the 3 then known codices, the Dresden, the Madrid Codex, and the one in Paris.
Konorisov's fascination with the book grew when he read an article concluding that Maya glyphs were undecipherable. He took it as a challenge and obtained a degree in linguistics to become a lone Russian Mayanist in a field dominated by Eric Thompson.
Because he was behind the Iron Curtain during the Stalinist period, he also was intrinsically very isolated. He didn't have a lot of ideas floating around that he had inherited from other people, ideas that, in Thompson's case, were quite simply wrong. It gave him a fresh perspective. He was kind of a clean slate, you might say.
As a linguist, Konorisov knew the first step in analyzing an unknown writing system is to count the signs. If a script has 20 to 35 signs, it is probably alphabetic, representing simple sounds. If there are 80 to 100 signs, it is probably based on syllables. But if a script has several hundred signs, it is surely logographic, or based on signs for whole words. A logographic system like Chinese has thousands of signs for thousands of words. The Maya script has about 800 signs. Too many to represent an alphabet, and far too few to have signs for each word of a language. So scholars assumed that it was a limited logographic system, with signs for only a few hundred words. But Knorosov knew that no writing system consists purely of one kind of sign. Our own alphabet uses numerals and logograms. Knorosov realized the Maya script was also a mixed system, combining word signs and phonetic signs. With this insight, he turned to the Madrid Codex, where the glyphs for the 4 directions had been identified. He focused on the glyph for west, searching for syllables. It was made up of 2 signs. On the bottom was the sun sign, depicted in all its variations by 4 spokes or petals. On the top was a hand with thumb and forefinger touching. Eric Thompson had argued that the hand sign meant completion and read the glyph as completion of sun or sunset, therefore west. For Thompson, glyphs represented ideas, not sounds.
Eric was kind of bullheaded about things like this. He had determined to his own satisfaction that the hieroglyphs were not phonetic and could not be phonetic, and he stuck with that.
But Knorosov disagreed. He suspected that the glyphs might in fact be tied to the sounds of spoken Maya. He knew that in Maya, the word for west is chikin and the word for sun is kin. So he suggested that the hand sign should be read not as the concept, completion, but as the syllable chi. When combined with the logogram for sun, it forms chikin. To rule out coincidence, Knorosov identified syllables in other glyphs, proving that at least some corresponded to the sounds of spoken Maya.
And of course, the Soviet propaganda apparatus jumped on this and said, look, inspired by the wonders of Marxism, Leninism, this young scholar has done what none of the imperialist scholars in Britain or the United States or Germany could ever do. He's shown how the Maya wrote. And Thompson, a lifelong anti-communist, decided that this was a total fraud and that the world should be straightened out about this.
Some of Knorosov's specific readings were questionable. Seizing upon them, Thompson discredited his entire method. Tragically, Knorosov's priceless insights went unrecognized in the West. But the era of lone scholars scattered across the world was coming to an end. The change began in Palenque, driven by Merle Green Robertson. She had spent years documenting the site's art for future generations. While she was working, an art professor named Linda Sheely visited.
When I walked among Palenque's buildings, I saw a culture where the art was central. And I really was driven to understand who had done it and why and how.
Sheely began to help Robertson. As they worked, she gained an intimate knowledge of the site. It would be put to use in 1973, when Robertson hosted a conference at Palenque. There, Sheely met Peter Matthews, who had spent the past winter analyzing books of Palenque's glyphs.
Basically, by the end of that process, I had 3 huge notebooks filled up with transcriptions in Thompson's wretched T numbers of all the signs of every single inscription from Palenque.
Matthews teamed up with Sheely to reconstruct Palenque's dynastic history. They knew that some royal names at Palenque are accompanied by a title, a winged sun sign.
And so what we did is we went through and found every example of this title and wrote down the nearest date.
Poring over Palenque's inscriptions, they found over 40 names with the royal title. Each was accompanied by a date and glyph describing the event on that date. For example, a birth shown by the upended head of an iguana. As Shealy and Matthews arranged the births, deaths, and ceremonies by date, the patterns emerged. One ruler stood out, whom they dubbed Lord Shield. He was born on the 23rd of March, 603. His name glyph featured a warrior's shield. It led them to Palenque's most dominant building, the Temple of the Inscriptions. The meaning of its hieroglyphic tablets had been an enigma for centuries. Shealy and Matthews now saw that the panels were filled with references to Lord Shield and key events of his life. Suddenly, a discovery made in 1948 took on new meaning. A hidden staircase was found in the temple's inner chamber, leading to a crypt with a limestone sarcophagus. Inside was a human skeleton, masked in jade. Shealy and Matthews realized that this must be the body of Lord Shield. For the first time, hieroglyphs were connected to the remains of a Maya ruler. The glyphs Shealy and Matthews grasped traced the life stories of Lord Shield and 5 of his successors.
And they came out and literally announced that they had sort of cracked the dynasty of Palenque. And they had names of the rulers and the times when they ruled.
We had them with funny names like Sunshield and a Lord Toothache.
At that point, Moises Morales, a local guide, jumped up and said, "Why is it that when important discoveries like this are made, the name is given in English, Lord Shield, or Escudo in Spanish?" He said, "These people spoke Maya."
So they called the king Pakal, a Mayan word later confirmed phonetically to mean shield.
It was just a giddy sort of feeling, and I'll never forget it. It was a real turning point in Maya studies.
After years of work, the cracking of the Maya code was within reach. But one big hurdle remained. To read the hieroglyphs aloud in the language in which they were written, the phonetic decipherment begun by Knorosov had to be completed. Despite decades of effort, fewer than 30 syllabic signs could be read with confidence. The final key to the sounds of the glyphs would be found by David Stewart, whose education as a Mayanist began at an early age. His father, George, often brought him along on field trips to Mesoamerica. One of David's most memorable expeditions was to Coba in the Yucatan.
It was just kind of an incredible place to wander around as a kid. What really got me, though, was while we were at Coba, there were a couple of monuments that were actually discovered. My dad would drop everything and work on drawing the monument. And I would just sort of look over his shoulder while he was doing that and thought, gee, you know, this is pretty amazing.
He decided he would go out and draw some himself. So he'd take his crayons and paper and everything and go out and started drawing hieroglyphs.
By the time we got back to the States, my inner soul had been so affected by that experience that I just wanted to keep going back.
Two years later, George took David to meet Linda Shealy.
I remember kind of sitting there quietly in the office while she was drawing a glyph, and I don't know why I blurted this out, but I said, "Oh, that's a fire glyph." And Linda kind of paused, and I remember she sort of looked behind her shoulder and over at me and said, "Yeah, you're right, kid. That's a firoglyph."
George said that they would really appreciate it if there was ever a chance that David could study with me or something. And so on the spur of the moment, I said, why didn't he come down to Palenque this summer?
And the next summer was one of the most amazing times of my life. She allowed me to help her check her drawings. We were in the temples with flashlights, with her drawings on clipboards, making corrections. I remember Linda was saying, "Okay, kid, if you want to learn Maya glyphs, you got to do it on your own."
I gave him the tablet of the cross, told him to go out on the back porch and figure out as much as he could about it. He came back a couple of days later and had the same amount of structural understanding of the text that it had taken me 3 years to do. And so I figured then that he was really quite good.
At age 12, David presented his first scholarly paper on Maya hieroglyphs.
And he gives a paper that was certainly beyond the abilities of about 2/3 or 3/4 of the audience to follow. It was a scholarly paper, and mostly people were just amazed.
Then, after his high school graduation, Stewart received an unexpected call. He had won a MacArthur Fellowship, popularly known as the Genius Award. At age 18, he was the youngest recipient ever of the prestigious prize. Stewart delayed college to work on the glyphs full-time. It was then that he made his great discovery. It came when he focused on a pair of signs already believed to have been deciphered. Eric Thompson had pointed out that one of these signs signaled a count forward to a new date. The other, a count backward to a prior date. The two glyphs shared a common sign, what Thompson called either a water sign or the head of a shark, or shok in Maya. Shok can also mean to count. But Stewart discovered that several other signs also substituted for the shark. A human head, a monkey, and in one instance, a bracket-shaped sign. Did all these signs stand for the word count? Stewart felt there was a simpler explanation. The bracket symbol was also the phonetic sign for the syllable oo. Suddenly, he realized that all these signs stood for the syllable oo. The proof? Each sign freely substituted for the oo bracket in contexts that had nothing to do with counting.
What Dave Stewart did was show us that many of these substitutions are purely phonetic substitutions that are spelling exactly the same word in slightly different ways.
The backward and forward counting glyphs were phonetically spelled phrases. E-U-T and U-T-Ya. In Maya, E-Ut means "and then it happened," and U-T means "since it happened." The words that Thompson had viewed as mere dates were in fact telling a story. And then it happened, on the day 1 Kib 14 Kankin, that she was adorned in marriage, Lady Khatun Ahau, Lady of Naman. And after 10 days, 11 months, 1 year and 1 score of years, then it happened on the day 4 Kimi 14 Wo that their daughter was born, the royal Sun Lady. The implications were revolutionary. Epigraphers had been searching for a single sign for each syllabic sound. But if oo was represented by more than one sign, then other syllables might be as well.
One of the things about Maya writing which makes it so complicated is their love of substitutions. One sound can have 13, 14, 15 different versions. They hated repeating themselves and loved showing new things. And the recognition of those substitution patterns was what began to break down the complexity of Maya writing into something which was a manageable, comprehensible system.
Each time a Maya scribe wrote a given word or phrase, he could choose from a variety of signs and combine them in new ways. A sign could be written abstractly or as the head of a human, animal, or god. One sign could be slipped inside another or partly overlapped. Two signs could join, merging their attributes. Glyphs even included figures of monsters,